you, gentlemen, for being here. The one thing of many that I learned in Uzbekistan, Mr. Ambassador, was that their forecast for the future is bleak. They think when we leave Afghanistan, the Pakistanis will support the Taliban, that they'll move into southern Afghanistan, that Iran will influence Iraq more, move in that region. And I'm sure you've heard all of those things. They're very concerned about their country and terrorist networks moving into their country. I have a lot of questions. I'll ask them, and we'll get to as many answers from both of you as we can. These groups that we've mentioned that are in the region, Central Asia specifically, where do they get their money? Where do they get their money? Somebody say something, the clock's running.
The IMU, as an example, I think it was mentioned, this is a group that has its origins, of course, in Uzbekistan, has been adaptable over the years, moved to Tajikistan at one period, was in Kabul, as noted, in the late 1990s, and where it began its affiliation with al-Qaeda. It works out of the Pakistani tribal areas in cooperation with the Pakistani Taliban, with Haqqani network in some cases. These groups are therefore tied into the tribal networks that finance the broader terrorist work in the tribal regions of Pakistan and then into western Afghanistan, where they conduct.
But where do they get their money? Where does that money come from that ends up in Uzbekistan?
Yeah, there are a variety of financing sources for the groups in Afghanistan. Some of it continues to come in from outside sources, as it had traditionally with al-Qaeda, into the Haqqani network, for instance, we know raises money, continues to raise money in the Persian Gulf states. They raise money through illicit activities, through narcotics trafficking, through criminal activity, through extortion. There are a variety of criminal and illicit activities that they undertake to raise money in that area.
Has the FTO designation had an effect on IJU and IMU?
The FTO designations do give us the opportunity to work with partners around the world, including through multilateral organizations such as FATF and the UN bodies, to seize funds, to investigate financing flows. So the FTO designation is a highly useful tool by the State Department, by the FBI, by DOJ, and other law enforcement agencies.
The United States leaving Afghanistan, Department of Defense has made a determination that it's cheaper to leave that equipment, some of the equipment there, not bring it home. That's a Department of Defense decision. Two questions about that. How do we know some of that's not going to end up in the hands of the bad guys? And second, is any of that going to be available for our partners in the region like the Uzbekistan government? Mr. Ambassador.
Sir, they're still reviewing exactly what equipment is going to be left in Afghanistan, and then what equipment might be available to our friends in Central Asia. My supposition is that the equipment that might be made available would be non-lethal assistance, and we've already had some discussions with the Central Asian states about what they might be interested in. But again, this is still at a very preliminary stage.
And how do we make sure that they don't end up in any equipment, especially the lethal equipment, ends up in the hands of the bad guys?
Well, again, I think most of the lethal equipment is probably going to be taken out of Afghanistan, and that's points to some of the points that were made earlier about the importance of these retrograde operations. Many of the Central Asian states do not want to see lethal equipment transiting through their territory, so a lot of that will have to be probably flown out or perhaps transited out through Pakistan.
And there's other players in the region. There's the Chinese, there's the Iranians, and there's the Russians, all just looking to move in my opinion. What do you see as their role in Central Asia going to be as the United States leaves Afghanistan?
I think I'd perhaps differ slightly with your characterization. I think both the Chinese and the Russians share our objectives of seeing a peaceful transition. The Chinese have been putting a lot of money into Central Asia, into the infrastructure networks, and I think overall support this idea of regional integration, as do the Russians. But, you know, we still need to work with them a little bit on getting them to do more in Afghanistan itself. The Chinese have investigated in the Ainak copper mine, for example, but they have not invested to the extent that, say, the Indians have. Likewise, we've tried very hard to work cooperatively with the Russians on Central Asia and to be very transparent with them and figure out ways that we can work together. And I think we have shared objectives in Central Asia and in Afghanistan. So we'll continue to pursue those common objectives. The Iranians have not, interestingly, played that large a role in the region. Most of the countries of Central Asia have stiff-armed them and kept them away, fully aware of our concerns and others' concerns about their support for their efforts to acquire nuclear weapons. They all share our misgivings and our opposition to Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon. So again, to the extent that they have relations, they have them to allow transit through Iranian territory so that they can get their goods to a port in the Indian Ocean. And again, I think all of them have been supportive of sanctions, international sanctions efforts.
Thank you. I yield back.